Again, all right, let's continue. Chapter 5, a kind of revolution. American victory over the British Army was made possible by the existence of an already armed people. Just about every white male had a gun and could shoot. The revolutionary leadership distrusted the mobs of the poor, but they knew the revolution had no appeal to slaves and the Indians. They would have to woo the armed white population. That's going to be very important later on. This was not easy. Yes, mechanics and sailors and some others were incensed against the British, but general enthusiasm for the war was not strong. While much of the white male population went into military service at one time or another during the war, only a small fraction stayed. John Shy, in his study of the Revolutionary Army, a people numerous and armed, says they grew weary of being bullied by local committees of safety, by corrupt deputy assistant commissionaries for supply, and by bands of ragged strangers with guns in their hands calling themselves soldiers of the revolution. Shy estimates that perhaps a fifth of the population was actively treasonous. John Adams had estimated a third opposed, a third in support, and a third neutral. Alexander Hamilton, an aide of George Washington and an up-and-coming member of the new elite, wrote from his headquarters, "Our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us." Slavery got in the way of the South. South Carolina, insecure since the slave uprising in Stono in 1739, could hardly fight against the British. Her militia had to be used to keep slaves under control. The men who first joined the colonial militia were generally hallmarks of respectability or at least of full citizenship. In their communities, Shy says, excluded from the militia were friendly Indians, free Negroes, white servants, and free white men who had no stable home. But desperation led to the recruiting of the less respectable whites. Massachusetts and Virginia provided for drafting strollers, vagrants, into the militia. In fact, the military became a place of promise for the poor, who might rise in rank, require some money, change their social status. Here was the traditional device by which those in charge of any social order mobilize and discipline a recalcitrant population, offering the adventure and rewards of military service to get poor white people to fight for a cause they might not see clearly as their own. We are reading a people's history of the United States. And again, I need to mirror. I don't know why it does that. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. A wounded American lieutenant at Bunker Hill, interviewed by Peter Oliver, a Tory who admittedly might have been looking for such a response, told how he had joined the rebel forces. "I was a shoemaker and got my living by my labor. When this rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors got into commission who were no better off than myself. I was very ambitious and did not like to see those men above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier. I offered to enlist upon having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. I imagined myself now in a way of promotion. If I was killed in battle, there would be an end of me. But if my captain was killed, I should rise in rank and should still have a chance to rise higher. These, sir, were the only motives of my entering into the service. For as to the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it." So, I mean, again, that's okay. No, I'm not going live on TikTok too. I'm not going live on TikTok today. I'm just TikToked out. But again, this is the hallmark. You know, it has always been thus, hasn't it? You know, you've got people that were so desperate to rise in rank, they would do anything to, rise above their station. And that was the only way they could do it. All right. John Shy investigated the subsequent experience of that Bunker Hill lieutenant. He was William Scott of Petersboro, New Hampshire, and after a year as prisoner of the British, he escaped, made his way back to the American army, fought in battles in New York, was captured again by the British, and escaped again by swimming in the Hudson River one night with his sword tied around his neck and his watch pinned to his hat. He returned to New Hampshire, recruited a company of his own, including his two eldest sons, and fought in various battles until his health gave way. He watched his eldest son die of camp fever after 6 years of service. He had sold his farm in Peterborough for a note that with inflation became worthless. After the war, he came to public attention when he rescued 8 people from drowning after their boat turned over in the New York harbor. He then got a job surveying western lands with the army. He caught fever and died in 1796. Scott was one of many revolutionary fighters, usually of lower military ranks, from poor and obscure backgrounds. Shy's study of the Peterborough contingent shows that prominent and substantial citizens of the town had served only briefly in the war. Other American towns show the same pattern. As Shy puts it, revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happier and more prosperous than at any other time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 1783. A very old story. A very old story indeed. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues, made people choose sides in the one contest that was publicly important, forced people from the side of the revolution whose interest in independence was not at all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through the generations, consciously or not, that war made these more secure against eternal trouble. The force of military preparation had a way of pushing neutral people into line. In Connecticut, for instance, a law was passed requiring military service of all males between 16 and 60, omitting certain governing officials, ministers, Yale students, and faculty, Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. Someone called to duty could provide a substitute or get out of it by paying £5. When 18 men failed to show up for military duty, they were jailed, and in order to be released, had to pledge to fight in the war. Shy says, the mechanism for their political conversion was the militia. What looks like the democratization of the military forces in modern times shows up as something different, a way of forcing large numbers of reluctant people to associate themselves with the national cause, and by the end of the process, believe in it. Here, in the war for liberty, was conscription, as usual, cognizant of wealth, with the impressment riots against the British still remembered. Impressment of seamen by the American Navy was taking place by 1779. A Pennsylvania official said, "We cannot help observing how similar this conduct is to that of the British officers during the subjugation of Great Britain, and are persuaded it will have the same unhappy effects, vis-a-vis an estrangement of the affections of the people from authority, which by an easy progression will proceed to open opposition and bloodshed." Watching the new tight discipline of Washington's army, a chaplain in Concord, Massachusetts wrote, "New lords, new laws. The strictest government is taking place, and a great distinction is made between officers and men. Everything is made to show his place and keep it, and be immediately tied up, and receive not only 1 but 30 or 40 lashes." The Americans lost the first battles of the war, Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, and the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton, and then in a turning point, a big battle at Saratoga in New York in 1777. Washington's frozen army hung on at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. The war turned to the south, where British won victory after victory, until the Americans, aided by a large French army, with the French Navy blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements, won the final victory of the war at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. Through all this, the suppressed conflicts between rich and poor among the Americans kept reappearing. In the midst of the war in Philadelphia, where Eric Foner described it as a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others. The inflation, prices rose in 1 month that year by 45%, led to agitation and calls for action. One Philadelphia newspaper carried a reminder that in Europe, the peoples have always done themselves justice when the scarcity of bread has risen from the avarice of forestallers. They have broken open magazines, appropriated stores to their own use without paying for them, and in some instances have hung up the culprits who created their distress. In May of 1779, the First Company of Philadelphia Artillery petitioned the Assembly about the troubles of the middling and poor, and threatened violence against those who are avariciously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the most virtuous part of the community. That same month, there was a mass meeting, an extra-legal gathering, which called for price reductions and initiated an investigation of Robert Morris, a rich Philadelphia man who was accused of holding food from the market. In October, from the Fort Wilson riot, in which a militia group marched into the city and to the house of James Wilson, a wealthy lawyer and revolutionary official who had opposed price controls and the Democratic Constitution adopted in Pennsylvania in 1776, the militia were driven away by a silk stocking brigade of well-off Philadelphia citizens. It seems that the majority of white colonists who had a bit of land or no property at all were still better off than slaves or indentured servants or Indians, and could be wooed into the coalition of the Revolution. But when the sacrifices of a war became more bitter, the privileges and safety of the rich became harder to accept. About 10% of the white population, an estimate of Jackson, Maine, and the social structure of revolutionary America, large landowners and merchants held 1,000 pounds or more in personal property and 1,000 pounds in land at the least, and these men owned nearly half the wealth of the country and held as slaves 1/7 of the country's people. The Continental Congress, which had governed the colonies through the war, was dominated by rich men, linked together in factions and compacts by business and family connections. These links connected North and South, East and West. For instance, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was connected with the Adamses of Massachusetts and Shippens of Pennsylvania. Delegates from middle and southern colonies were connected with Robert Morris of Pennsylvania through commerce and land speculation. Morris was superintendent of finance, and his assistant was Governor Morris. Morris' plan was to give more assurance to those who had loaned money to the Continental Congress and gain the support of officers by voting half pay for life for those who stuck out to the end. This ignored the common soldier, who was not getting paid, who was suffering in cold, dying of sickness, watching the civilian profiteers get rich. On New Year's Day of 1781, the Pennsylvania troop near Morristown, New Jersey, perhaps emboldened by rum, dispersed their officers, killed one captain, wounded others, and were marching fully armed with cannon toward the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. George Washington handled it cautiously. Informed of these developments by General Anthony Wayne, he told Wayne not to use force. He was worried that the rebellion might spread to his own troops. He suggested Wayne get a list of the soldiers' grievances and said Congress should not flee Philadelphia because then the way would be open for the soldiers to be joined by Philadelphia citizens. He sent Knox rushing to New England on his horse to get 3 months' pay for the soldiers, while he prepared 1,000 men to march on the mutineers as a last resort. A peace was negotiated in which one half of the men were discharged, the other half got furloughs. Shortly after this, a small mutiny took place in New Jersey line, involving 200 men who defied their officers and started out for the state capital at Trenton. Now Washington was ready. 600 men who gathered themselves had been well fed, clothed, and marched on the mutineers, surrounded and disarmed them. The three ringleaders were put on trial immediately in the field. One was pardoned, the 2 were shot by firing squads made of their own friends, who wept as they pulled the triggers. It was an example, Washington said. Amazing. That scene never made it into the show Washington Spies, did it? Amazing. George Washington, I said that already. 2 years later, there was another mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. The war was over and the army had disbanded, but 80 soldiers demanding their pay invaded the Continental Congress headquarters in Philadelphia and forced the members to flee across the river to Princeton. Ignominiously turned out the doors. As one historian sorrowfully wrote, John Fiske of the critical period, by a handful of drunken mutineers. What soldiers in the Revolution could do only rarely, rebel against their authorities, civilians could do much more easily. Ronald Hoffman says the Revolution plunged the states of Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, to a much lesser degree, Virginia, into divisive civil conflicts that persisted during the entire period of struggle. The Southern lower classes resisted being mobilized for the Revolution. They saw themselves under the rule of a political elite, win or lose against the British. In Maryland, for instance, by the new Constitution of 1776, to run for governor, one had to own £5,000 of property. To run for state senator, £1,000. Thus, 90% of the population were excluded from holding office. And so, as Hoffman says, small slaveholders, non-slaveholders, planters, tenants, renters, and casual day laborers posed a serious problem for social control of the Whig elite. With black slaves 25% of the population, in some counties 50%, fear of slave revolts grew. George Washington had turned down the request of blacks seeking freedom to fight in the Revolutionary Army. Imagine that. Our first president of the United States turned down black people from serving in the army. Isn't that amazing? And it's really hard, isn't it? It's really hard to take seriously the, I don't know, calls for freedom, the calls for justice. You know, it's really hard to take seriously the very Constitution. All men are created equal. Imagine that. All men are created equal, only to be turned away and not granted the very freedom the Constitution promised. Rules for thee, not for me, and freedom for me, not for thee. Isn't that amazing? So, when the British military commander in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to the Virginia slaves who joined his forces, this created consternation. A report from one Maryland county worried about poor whites encouraging slave runaways. The insolence of the Negroes in this county is come to such a height that we are under a necessity of disarming them, which we effected on Saturday last. We took about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, etc. The maliciousness and imprudent speeches of some among the lower classes of whites have induced them to believe that their freedom depended on the success of the king's troops. We cannot therefore be too vigilant, nor too rigorous with those who promote and encourage this disposition in our slaves. Imagine if Britain had won the war. Imagine if Britain had won the Revolutionary War. Slavery would have been done away with a lot sooner, and we'd all be speaking English. Let that sink in. Okay, moving on. Even more unsettling was white rioting in Maryland against leading families supporting the revolution who were suspected of hoarding needed commodities. The class hatred of some of these disloyal people were expressed by one man who said it was better for the people to lay down their arms and pay duties and taxes laid upon them by king and parliament than to be brought under the slavery and to be commanded and ordered about as they were. A wealthy Maryland landowner, Charles Carroll, took note of the surly mood all around him. Quote, "There is a mean, low, dirty envy which creeps through all ranks and cannot suffer a man a superiority of fortune, of merit, and of understanding in fellow citizens. Either of these are sure to entail a general ill will and dislike among the owners." Oh no, Despite this, Maryland authorities retained control. They made concessions, taxing land and slave more readily, letting debtors pay in paper money. It was a sacrifice by the upper class to maintain power, and it worked. In the lower South, however, in the Carolinas and Georgia, according to Hoffman, vast regions were left without the slightest apparition of authority. The general mood was to take no part in a war that seemed to have nothing for them. Authoritative personages on both sides demanded that common people supply material, reduce consumption, leave their families, and even risk their lives. Forced to make hard decisions, many flailed out in frustration or evaded and defied first one other side and then another. Washington's military commanded in the lower South. Nathanael Greene dealt with disloyalty by a policy of concessions to some, brutality to others. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he described a raid by his troops on loyalists. They made a dreadful carnage of them. Upwards of 100 were killed and most of the rest cut to pieces. It has had a very happy effect on those disaffected persons, of which there were too many in this country, Greene told one of his generals, to strike terror into our enemies and give spirit to our friends. On the other hand, he advised the governor of Georgia to open a door for the disaffected of your state to come in. In general, throughout the states, concessions were kept to a minimum. The new constitutions that were drawn up in all states from 1776 to 1780 were not much different from the old ones, although property qualifications for voting and holding office were lowered in some instances. In Massachusetts, they were actually increased. Only Pennsylvania abolished them totally. The new Bills of Rights had modifying provisions. North Carolina provided for religious freedom, adding that nothing herein contained shall be construed to exempt preachers of treasonable or seditious discourse from legal trial and punishment. Maryland, New York, Georgia, and Massachusetts took similar precautions. The American Revolution is sometimes said to have brought about the separation of church and state. The southern states made much such declarations, but after 1776, they adopted taxes that forced everyone to support Christian teachings. William G. McLaughlin, quoting Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892, said that this is a Christian nation, says of the separation of church and state in the Revolution that it was neither conceived nor carried out. Far from being left to itself, religion was embedded into every aspect and institution of American life. That would explain why, that would explain why much of the people in this country were okay with slavery. Christianity and slavery go hand in hand, it turns out. One would look in examining the Revolution's effect on class relations at what happened to land confiscated from fleeing loyalists. It was distributed in such a way as to give a double opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their friends and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation, finding itself possessed of enormous wealth. It could create the richest ruling class in history, George Washington being among them. And it still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the dispossessed. The huge landholdings of the Loyalists had been one of the great incentives to revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had more than 5 million acres, encompassing 21 counties. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded £30,000 a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected. He was a friend of George Washington. But other Loyalists, holding of great estates, especially those who were absentees, had their lands confiscated in New York. The number of freeholding small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were far fewer tenant farmers who had created so much trouble in the pre-Revolution years. Although the numbers of independent farmers grew, according to Roland Bernhoff and John Mirren, the class structures did not change radically. The ruling group went through a personal changes as the rising merchant families of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia slipped quite credibly into the social status, and sometimes the very houses of those who failed in business or suffering confiscation and exile for loyalty to the crown. Edmund Morgan sums up the class nature of the revolution this way: the fact that the lower ranks were involved in the contest should not obscure the fact that the content itself was generally a struggle for office and power between members of the upper class, the new against the established. Looking at the situation after the revolution, Richard Morris comments, "Everywhere one finds inequality. He finds the people of 'We the People of the United States,' a phrase coined by the very rich Governor Morris, did not mean Indians, blacks, or women or white servants. In fact, there were more indentured servants than ever, and the revolution did nothing to end and little to ameliorate white bondage." So basically, the revolution, the American Revolution, was nothing more than a transfer of wealth from one ruling class to the other. And we got hoodwinked. Again, I say this over and over again. I wonder how much better our lives would have been had we lost to the British in 1770s. I'm liking this chapter, aren't you? It goes on and on. I'm loving it. This is going to be a very dense chapter. Carl Diegler says, "Out of our past, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class. George Washington was the richest man in America. John Hancock was a prosperous Boston merchant. Benjamin Franklin was a wealthy printer, and so on. On the other hand, town mechanics, laborers, and seamen, as well as small farmers, were swept into the people by the rhetoric of the Revolution, by the camaraderie of military service, by the distribution of some land. Thus was created a substantial body of support, a national consensus, something that even with the exclusion of ignored and oppressed people could be called America." Staunton Lynn's close study of Dutchess County, New York, in Revolutionary period corroborates this. There was a tenant risings in 1766 against the huge feudal states in New York. The Rensselaerwick holding was 1,000,000 acres. Tenants, claiming more of this land for themselves, unable to get satisfaction in the courts, turned to violence. In Poughkeepsie, 1,700 armed tenants had closed the courts and broken open the jails, but the uprising was crushed. During the Revolution, there was a struggle in Dutchess County over the disposition of confiscated Loyalist land, but it was mainly between different elite groups. One of these, the Poughkeepsie Anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution, including men on the make, newcomers in land and business. They made promises to the tenants to gain their support, exploiting their grievances to build their own political careers and maintain their own fortunes. During the Revolution, to mobilize soldiers, the tenants were promised land. A prominent landowner in Dutchess County wrote in 1777 that a promise to make tenants freeholders, thus instantly bringing you at least 6,000 able farmers into the field. But the farmers who enlisted in the Revolution and expected to get something out of it found that as privates in the army, they received $6.66 a month. If that isn't a slap in the face, 666, amazing. $6.66. I mean, that's a little too on the nose, biblically speaking. While a colonel received $75 a month. They watched local government contractors like Melacton Smith and Matthew Pearson become rich, while the pay they received in continental currency became worthless with inflation. All this led tenants to become a threatening force in the midst of war. Many stopped paying rent. The legislature, worried, passed a bill to confiscate Loyalist land and add 400 new freeholders to the 1,800 already in the county. This meant a strong new voting bloc for the faction of the rich that would become anti-federalists in 1788. Once the new landholders were brought into the privileged, let's see. We have a guest. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Malam alaikum. Blessings, brother. Let's have a battle before I'm going my way.
Okay, let's have a battle. I'll keep reading this book and you will battle.
Okay, you said you read a book while I battle?
The People's History of
History of the United States.
by Howard Zinn.
Hey, can I say this? Can I say this before the battle begins? Skeptically speaking.
Go ahead.
My name's Raphael Lavaikan, yeah?
Yep.
And if you read my bio based on what I'm saying right now, and you believe it that on Thursdays I've got Psalms reading Thursdays, on Fridays I've got tie wearing Fridays, and on Saturday I've got book reading Saturdays. Today is actually a freestyle day, and tomorrow is actually a freestyle day again, but because my partner is not available, so that's why I'm here just going on different lives and networking with other persons. So it's actually amazing to see that when you said a while ago, you'll have a battle and I'll read a book. It's amazing, man, for this is what I do on Saturdays.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see how it goes. And I'll keep reading. Here we go.
This is the book I read first.
Uh-huh. Cultivating Purpose.
And then the next book I had read was
Cost and Management Accounting.
and for Saturday that went away, there's now 3 Saturdays reading book. The ladies have required something a little bit more, I had to give them what they had required.
Just a FYI, whenever you do book readings, make sure you hit the mirror function, and what that does is it allows people watching you to read the title without having to read backwards.
Thank you for that heads up moving forward.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's get
But I'm gonna send you the battle had begun. Whoa, I didn't even know.
Yeah, it already started. All right. I'm going to continue reading. All right. Let's see. Where did we leave off? Revolution, Americans. Americans were brought into privileged circle of the revolution. Okay. It seems that the rebellion against the British rule allowed a certain group of colonial elite to replace the loyal to England, give some benefits to small landowners, and leave poor white working people and tenant farmers in much of their old situation. What did the revolution mean to the Native American Indians? They had been ignored by the fine words of the Declaration, had not been considered equal, certainly not in choosing those who would govern the American territories in which they lived, nor in being able to pursue happiness, as they had been pursued by centuries before the white Europeans arrived. Now, with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin the inexorable process of pushing the Indians off their lands, killing them if they resisted. In short, as Francis Jennings puts it, the white Americans were fighting against the British imperial control of the East and for their own imperialism in the West. Before the Revolution, the Indians had been subdued by force in Virginia and in New England. Elsewhere, they had worked out modes of coexistence with the colonies. But around 1750, with the colonial population growing fast, the pressure to move westward onto new land set the stage for conflict with the Indians. Land agents from the east began appearing in the Ohio River Valley, on the territory of a confederation of tribes called the Covenant Chain, which the Iroquois were spokesmen. In New York, through intricate swindling, 800,000 acres of Mohawk land were taken, ending the period of Mohawk-New York friendship. Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks is recorded speaking his bitterness to the Governor George Clinton and had Provincial Council of New York in 1753.
Just gave you a follow, man.
Thank you. All right.
Hit your notification bell also.
All right. Thank you very much. This is what George Chief Hendrick said. Brother, When we come here to relate our grievances about our lands, we expected to have something done for us, and we have told you that the covenant chain of our forefathers was like to be broken. And brother, you tell us that we should redress at Albany, but we know them so well, we will not trust to them, for they, the Albany merchants, are no people, but devils. So, as soon as we come home, we will send up a belt of wampum to our brothers and other 5 nations to acquaint them the covenant chain is broken between you and us. So, brother, you are not to expect to hear from me any more, and the brothers, we desire to hear no more of you. When the British fought the French for North America in the 7 Years' War, the Indians fought on the side of the French. The French were traders but not occupiers of Indian lands, while the British clearly coveted their hunting grounds and living space. Someone reported the conversations of Shingas, chief of the Delaware Indians, with the British General Braddock, who sought his help among the French. Shingas asked General Braddock whether the Indians that were friends to the English might not be permitted to live and trade among the English and have hunting ground sufficient to sport themselves and families, on which General Braddock said that no savage should inherit the land, on which Shingas and other chiefs answered that if they might not have liberty to live on the land, they would not fight for it. When the war ended in 1763, the French, ignoring their old allies, ceded to the British lands west of the Appalachians. The Indians therefore united to make war on the British western forts. This is called Pontiac's conspiracy by the British, but a liberation war of independence, in the words used by Francis Jennings, under orders from British General Jeffrey Amherst. The commander of Fort Pitts gave the attacking Indian chiefs with whom he was negotiating blankets from the smallpox hospital. It was a pioneering effort at which is now called the biological warfare. The epidemic soon spread among the Indians. Despite this, the burning of villages, the British could not destroy the will of the Indians, who continued guerrilla warfare. A peace was made, and the British agreeing to establish a line of the Appalachians beyond which settlements could not encroach on Indian territory. This was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and it angered Americans. The original Virginia Charter said its land went westward to the ocean. It helps to explain why most of the Indians fought for England during the Revolution. With their French allies, then their English allies gone, the Indians faced a new land-coveting nation alone. The Americans assumed now that the Indian land was theirs, but the expeditions they sent westward to establish this were overcome, which they recognized in the names they gave these battles: Harmer's humiliation, St. Clair's shame, and even when General Anthony Wayne defeated the Indians, the Western Confederation, in 1798 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had to recognize their power. In the Treaty of Greenville, it was agreed that in return for certain concessions of land, the United States would give up claims to the Indian lands north of the Ohio, east of the Mississippi, and south of the Great Lakes, but that if the Indians decide to sell these lands, they would offer them first to the United States. Jennings, putting the Indians into the center of the American Revolution, after all, it was Indian land that everyone was fighting over, sees the revolution as a multiplicity of various oppressed and exploited people who preyed upon each other. With the Eastern elite controlling the land on the seaboard, the poor seeking land were forced to go west, there becoming a useful bulwark of the rich because, as Jennings says, the first target of the Indian's hatchet was the frontiersman's skull. The situation of black slaves as a result of the American Revolution was more complex. Thousands of blacks fought with the British. 5,000 were with the revolutionaries, most of them from the North. But there were also free blacks from Virginia and Maryland. The lower South was reluctant to arm blacks. Amid the urgency and chaos of war, thousands took their freedom, leaving on British ships at the end of the war to settle in England, Nova Scotia, West Indies, or Africa. Many others stayed in America as free blacks, evading their masters. In the northern states, the combination of blacks in the military, the lack of powerful economic need for slaves, and the rhetoric of the Revolution led to the end of slavery, but very slowly. As late as 1810, 30,000 blacks, one-fourth of the black population of the North, remained slaves. In 1840, there were still thousands of slaves in the North. In the Upper South, there were more free Negroes than before, leading to more controlled legislation. In the Lower South, slavery expanded with the growth of rice and cotton plantations. What the Revolution did was to create space and opportunity for blacks to begin making demands of white society. Sometimes these demands came from the new small elites in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Richmond, Savannah, sometimes from articulate and bold slaves. Pointing to the Declaration of Independence, blacks petitioned Congress and the state legislatures to abolish slavery, to give blacks equal rights. In Boston, blacks asked for city money, which whites were getting, to educate their children. In Norfolk, they asked to be allowed to testify in court. Nashville blacks asserted that free Negroes ought to have the same opportunities of doing well that any person would have. Peter Matthews, a free Negro butcher in Charleston, joined other free black artisans and tradesmen in petitioning the legislature to appeal discriminatory laws against blacks. In 1780, 7 blacks in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, petitioned the legislature for the right to vote, linking taxation to representation. There's that key word again. Taxation. Yeah, exactly. And for the first time, they're now free black men are demanding the same promises that were made in the Constitution. We apprehend ourselves to be aggrieved in that while we are not allowed the privilege of freemen of the state having no vote or influence in the election of those that tax us, yet many of our color, as it is well known, have cheerfully entered the field of battle in the defense of the common cause, and that as we conceive against a similar exertion of power in regard to taxation, too many well-known need a recital in this place. A black man, Benjamin Banneker, who taught himself mathematics and astronomy, predicted accurately a solar eclipse and was appointed to plan the new city of Washington, wrote Thomas Jefferson. I suppose it is the truth too well attested to you to need a proof here that we are a race of beings who have long labored under the abuse and the censure of the world, that we have long been looked upon with the eye of contempt, and that we have long been considered rather as brutish than human, and scarcely capable of mental endowments. I apprehend you will embrace every opportunity to eradicate the train of absurd and false ideas and opinions, which so generally prevails with respect to us, that your sentiments are concurrent with mine, which are that one universal Father hath given being to us all, and that we hath not only made us all of one flesh, but that he hath also, without partiality, afforded us all the same sensations and endowed us with all the same faculties. This was a letter written to Thomas Jefferson. Amazing. Banneker asked Jefferson. Go ahead.
Amazing. This is an actual letter that was written to him, right?
Yep. And he...
I'm witnessing history. I'm listening.
Yep. He also asked Jefferson to wean yourselves from the narrow prejudices which you have imbibed or partaken in. Jefferson tried his best as an enlightened, thoughtful individual might, but the structure of American society, the power of the cotton plantation, the slave trade, the politics of unity between northern and southern states, and the long culture of race prejudice in the colonies, well as his own weaknesses, that combination of practical need and ideological fixation kept Jefferson a slave owner throughout his life. Also, his bad use of his money. Thomas Jefferson was known as a spendthrift. He was very bad with his money, so he thought, if I let the slaves go, that might mean I'll have to work. And I can't do that. So Benjamin Franklin kept his slaves, even though he knew it was ideologically wrong. Amazing.
Amazing. You was a lazy man.
Yep. Lazy ass. I'll say it. I don't care. The inferior position of blacks and the exclusion of Indians from the new society the establishment of the supremacy for the rich and powerful in the new nation. All this was already settled in the colonies by the time of the Revolution. With English out of the way, it could now be put on paper, solidified, regularized, made legitimate by the Constitution of the United States, drafted at a convention of revolutionary leaders in Philadelphia. Too many Americans over the years, the Constitution drawn up in 1787 had seemed to a work of genius put together by wise, humane men who created a legal framework for democracy and equality. This view is stated a bit extravagantly by the historian George Bancroft, writing in the early 19th century. Quote, "The Constitution establishes nothing that interferes with the equality and individuality. It knows nothing of differences by descent or opinions, of favored classes, or legalized religion, or the political power of property. It leaves the individuals alongside of the individual as the sea it made up of drops. American society is composed of separate, free, and constantly moving atoms, even in reciprocal action, so that the institutions of law of the country rise out of the masses of individual thought, like the waters of the ocean are rolling evermore." So flowery, so wonderful, it was bullshit. Another view of the Constitution was put forward early in the 20th century by the historian Charles Beard, arousing anger and indignation, including a denunciatory editorial in the New York Times. He wrote in his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, "Insomuch as the primary object of a government, beyond the mere representation of physical violence, is the making of the rules which determine the property relations of members of society, the dominant classes, whose rights are thus to be determined, must perforce obtain from the government such rules as are constant from the larger interests necessary to the continuance of their economic processes, or they must themselves control the organs of government." So basically, he was saying, in order for the elite to survive, in order to them to maintain their control, they had to keep the status quo. They could not allow the poorer classes to receive power. In short, Beard said, the rich must, in their own interest, either control the government directly or control the laws by which government operates. There it is in black and white.
Control the laws, meaning the laws doesn't apply to them.
Exactly. Beard applied this general idea to the Constitution by studying the economic backgrounds and political ideas of the 55 men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draw up the Constitution. He found that a majority of them were lawyers by profession, that most of them were men of wealth in land, slaves, manufacturing, or shipping, that half of them had money loaned out at interest, and that 40 of the 50 held government bonds, according to the records of the Treasury Department. Thus, Beard found that most of the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest in establishing a strong federal government. A government for the businessman, by the businessman, and to the businessman. The manufacturers needed protective tariffs. The moneylenders wanted to stop the use of paper money to pay off debts. The land speculators wanted protection as they invaded Indian lands. Slave owners needed federal security against slave revolts and runaways. Bondholders wanted a government able to raise money by national taxation to pay off those bonds. 4 groups, Beard noted, were not represented in the Constitution: slaves, indentured servants, women, and men without property. And so the Constitution did not reflect the interests of those groups. He wanted to make it clear and did not think the Constitution was written merely to benefit the Founding Fathers personally, although one could not ignore the $150,000 fortune of Benjamin Franklin, the connections of Alexander Hamilton to wealthy interests through his father-in-law and brother-in-law, the great slave plantation of James Madison, the enormous landholdings of George Washington. Rather, it was to benefit the groups the Founding Fathers represented in economic interests they understood and felt in concrete, definite form through their own personal experience. Not everyone at the Philadelphia Convention fitted Beard's scheme. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was a holder of land property, and yet he opposed the ratification of the Constitution. Similarly, Luther Martin of Maryland, whose ancestors had obtained large tracts of land in New Jersey, opposed ratification. But with a few exceptions, Beard found a strong connection between the wealthy and the support of the Constitution. By 1787, there was not only a positive need for strong central government to protect the large economic interests, but also immediate fear of rebellion by discontented farmers. The chief event causing this fear was an uprising in the summer of 1786 in western Massachusetts, known as Shays' Rebellion. In the western towns of Massachusetts, there was a resentment against the legislature in Boston. The new Constitution of 1780 had raised the property qualifications for voting. No one could hold state office without being quite wealthy. Furthermore, the legislature was refusing to issue paper money, as had been done in some other states like Rhode Island, to make it easier for debt-ridden farmers to pay off their creditors. Illegal conventions began to assemble in some of the western counties to organize opposition to the legislature. At one of these, a man named Plow Jogger spoke his mind. Quote, "I have been greatly abused and have been obliged to do more than my part in the war, been loaded with class rates, town rates, provincial rates, continental rates, and all rates, been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and have had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all that we have. I think it's time for us to raise up and put a stop to it, and have no more courts, no sheriffs, and no collectors, no lawyers." The chairman of that meeting used his gavel to cut short the applause. He and others wanted to redress their grievances, but peacefully, by petition, and to the general court in Boston. However, before the scheduled meeting in the general court, there was going to be court proceedings in Hampshire County, in the towns of Northampton and Springfield, to seize the cattle of farmers who couldn't pay their debts, to take away their land, and now full of grain ready for harvest. So veterans of the Continental Army, also aggrieved because they had been treated poorly on discharge, given certificates for fortune redemption instead of immediate cash, began to organize the farmers into squads and companies. One of these veterans was Luke Day, who arrived the morning of court with a fife and drum corps, still angry with the memory of being locked up in debtor's prison in the heat of the previous summer. The sheriff looked to the local militia to defend the court against these armed farmers, but most of the militia was with Luke Day. The sheriff did manage to gather 500 men, and the judges put on their black silk robes, waiting for the sheriff to protect their trip to the courthouse. But there at the courthouse steps, Luke Day stood with a petition asserting the people's constitutional rights to protest the unconstitutional acts of the general court, asking the judges to adjourn until the general court could act on behalf of the farmers. Standing with Luke Day were 1,500 armed farmers. The judges adjourned. Shortly after, at courthouses in Worcester and Athol, farmers with guns prevented the courts from meeting to take away their property, and the militia were too sympathetic to the farmers or too outnumbered to act. In Concord, a 50-year-old veteran of 2 years, Job Shattuck, led a caravan of carts, wagons, horses, and oxen onto the town green while a message was sent to the judges. Quote, "The voice of this people in this county is such that the court shall not enter this courthouse until such a time as the people shall have redress of the grievances they labor under the present." A county convention then suggested the courts adjourn, which they did. At Great Barrington, a militia of 1,000 faced a square crowded with armed men and boys, but the militia was split in its opinion. When the Chief Justice suggested the militia divide, those in favor of the court sitting to go onto the right side of the road and those against to the left, 200 of the militia went to the right, 800 to the left, and then the judges adjourned. Then the crowd went to the home of the Chief Justice, who agreed to sign a pledge that the court should not sit until the Massachusetts General Court met. The crowd went back to the square, broke open the county jail and set free the debtors. The Chief Justice, a county doctor, said, quote, "I have never heard anybody point out a better way to have their grievances redressed than the people have taken." I will repeat that. I have never heard of anybody point out a better way to have their grievances redressed than the people have taken. I guess an argument...
Persons to go to the right and persons to go to the left. You have never seen a better way to address the matter.
Armed resistance against the judges. I mean, who am I to disagree with that opinion? I mean, it worked several times in several cases, in several instances in history. The violent resistance of tyranny seems to have worked. And that's why they hate it so much. And that is why they're pitting us against each other. And this is why they want us fighting at every chance. Because when we're too busy fighting each other, we're not paying attention to the real problem. Interesting. The governor and the political leaders of...
That's interesting for real, for when they said who in agreement or who in disagreement to the right, to the left, then they had 800 persons to the right and 200 to the left. It's all about the majority rules, you know.
Oh,
No justice was actually given. Suppose the persons that went to the right, the two in 200, was actually the one that was speaking the right. But guess what? Because the 800 went to the left, they gave the ruling to the majority.
well, they had the most guns.
And his statement was that's the best way to deal with things, and you're arguing the point with they had used it many times.
The fact...
Okay.
The fact is that armed resistance is what won the day. When the judges saw that they were in the minority and they had more guns pointed at them, that's when they realized, oh, we better not do this. We better not take their land. We better not disenfranchise them anymore, because if we do, they're going to overthrow our power.
It had worked out in our favor, yes. But all I'm saying is, suppose it was the case that the majority went to the side that was saying, yay, they should have taken our land. How would it have worked out? That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I guess it would have been a sad day. It would have been a sad day in this country, but luckily the majority were the ones that were being tyrannized. They were the ones being bullied. They were the ones that were suffering the most. So it could have gone either way, but it just turned out that more people were suffering, so they ended up siding with the people that were fighting using armed resistance. So it could have gone either way, but it just turns out that when enough people suffer, they will switch sides. It's quite interesting. The problem went even beyond Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, the debtors were taken over the legislature and were issuing paper money. In New Hampshire, several hundred men in 1786 surrounded the legislature in Exeter, asking that taxes be returned and paper money issued. They dispersed only when military action was threatened. Daniel Shays entered the scene in western Massachusetts, a poor farmhand when the Revolution broke out. He joined the Continental Army, fought at Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Saratoga, and was wounded in action. In 1780, he was not paid. He resigned from the army, went home, and soon found himself in court for non-payment of debts. He also saw that what was happening to others, a sick woman unable to pay, had her bed taken away from under her. What brought Shays fully into the situation was that on September 19th, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts met in Worcester and indicted 11 leaders of the rebellion, including 3 of his friends, as disorderly, riotous, seditious persons who unlawfully and by force of arms prevented the execution of justice and the laws of the Commonwealth. The Supreme Court planned to meet again in Springfield a week later, and there was talk of Luke Days being indicted. Shays organized several hundred armed farmers, most of them veterans of the war, and led them to Springfield, where they found a general with 900 soldiers and cannon. Shays asked the general for permission to parade, which the general granted. So Shays and his men moved through the square, drums banging and fifes blowing. As they marched through, ranks grew. Some of the militia joined, and reinforcements began coming in from the countryside. The judges postponed hearings for a day, then adjourned the court. Now the general court, meeting in Boston, was told by Governor James Bowdoin to vindicate the insulted dignity of the government. The recent rebels against England, secure in office, were calling for law and order. Sam Adams helped draw up a riot act as a resolution suspending habeas corpus to allow the authorities to keep people in jail without trial. At the same time, the legislature moved to make some concessions to the angry farmers, saying certain old taxes could now be paid in goods instead of money. Amazing. The very people who were instruments in the Revolutionary War were now going against the common people, against the farmers, against the poor and the downtrodden. It's amazing. Oh, we've got 5 pages left. Let's keep moving. This didn't help. In Worcester, 160 insurgents appeared at the courthouse. The sheriff read the riot act. The insurgents said they would disperse only if the judges did. The sheriff shouted something about hanging. Someone came up behind him and put a sprig of hemlock in his hat. The judges left. Ooh, wow. Amazing. Basically, they were saying, here's some hemlock, go poison yourself. Confrontations between farmers and militia now multiplied. The winter snows began to interfere with the trips of farmers to the courthouses. When Shays began marching 1,000 men into Boston, a blizzard forced them back, and one of his men froze to death. An army came into the field led by General Benjamin Lincoln on money raised by Boston merchants. In an artillery duel, 3 rebels were killed. One soldier stepped in front of his own artillery piece and lost both of his arms. The winter grew worse. The rebels were outnumbered and on the run. Shays took refuge in Vermont, and his followers began to surrender. There were a few more deaths in battle, and then sporadic, disorganized, desperate acts of violence against authority. The burning of barns, the slaughter of a general's horse. One government soldier was killed in an eerie nighttime collision of 2 sleighs. Captured rebels were put on trial in Northampton, and 6 were sentenced to death. A note was left on the door of the High Sheriff of Pittsfield. I understand that there is a number of my countrymen condemned to die because they fought for justice. I pray have a care that you assist not in the execution of so horrid a crime. For by all that is above, he that condemns and he that executes shall share alike. Prepare for death with speed, for your life or mine is short. When the woods are covered with leaves, I shall return and pay you a short visit. Oops. 33 more rebels were put on trial and 6 more were condemned to death. Arguments took place over whether the hangings should go forward. General Lincoln urged mercy, and a commission of clemency by Samuel Adams said, "In monarchy, the crime of treason may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the law of a public ought to suffer death." Several hangings followed. Some of the condemned were pardoned. Shays in Vermont was pardoned in 1788 and returned to Massachusetts, where he died poor and obscure in 1825. It was Thomas Jefferson in France, as ambassador at the time of Shays' rebellion, who spoke of such uprisings as healthy for society. Really now? In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of the government. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's natural manure." Yikes. But Jefferson was far from the scene, and political and economic elite of the country were not so tolerant. They worried that the example might spread. A veteran of Washington's army, General Henry Knox, founded an organization of army veterans, the Order of Cincinnati, presumably, as one historian put it, for the purpose of cherishing the heroic memories of the struggle in which they had taken part, but also it seemed to watch out for the radicalism of the new country. Knox wrote to Washington in late 1786 about Shays' rebellion, and in so doing, so expressed the thoughts of many of the wealthy and powerful leaders of the country. Quote, "The people who are the insurgents have never paid any or but very little taxes." Well, that's because they don't have any. They don't have any money to pay taxes. Anyway, but they see the weakness of the government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make us the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. Well, there's an idea. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice, and ought to be swept away from the face of the earth. I agree. Alexander Hamilton, aide to Washington during the war, was one of the most forceful and astute leaders of the newest aristocracy. He had voiced his political philosophy as such, quote, "All communities divided themselves into a few and the many. The first are the rich and the well-born, and the others the mass of the people. The voice of the people have said to be the voice of God. However, generally this maxim has been quoted and believed. It is not true, in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct permanent share in the government. Can a democratic assembly who annually revolve in the glass of the peoples be supposed steadily to pursue the public good? Nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy." So therefore, Alexander Hamilton did not like democracy very much. At the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton suggested a president and Senate chosen for life. Well, let's just have a king while we're at it. Why have a president and Senate? Let's just bring back the Roman Empire. Yep, that's what they were talking about in the 1780s. Unbelievable. The convention did not take his suggestion, thankfully, but neither did it provide for popular elections, except in the case of the House of Representatives, where the qualifications were set by state legislatures, which require property holding for voting in almost all the states, excluding women, Indians, and slaves. The Constitution provided for senators to be elected by the state legislators, for the president to be elected by electors chosen by the state legislators, and for the Supreme Court to be appointed by the president. Yikes. The problem of democracy in the post-revolutionary society was not, however, that the Constitution limitations on voting. It lay deeper beyond the Constitution, in the division of society into rich and poor. For if sometime had great wealth and great influence, if they had the land, the money, the newspapers, the church, the educational system, how could voting, however broad, cut into such power? There was still another problem. Wasn't it the nature of representative government, even when most broadly based, to be conservative, to prevent tumultuous change? It came time to ratify the Constitution, to submit to a vote in state conventions, which approval of 9 of the 13 required to ratify it. In New York, where debate over ratification was intense, a series of newspaper articles appeared anonymously, and they tell as much about the nature of the Constitution. These articles favored adoption of the Constitution, were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and came to be known as the Federalist Papers. Opponents of the Constitution became known as Anti-Federalists. In Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison argued that representative government was needed to maintain peace in a society ridden by factional disputes. These disputes came from various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed a distinct interest in society. The problem, he said, was how to control the factional struggles that came from inequalities in wealth. Minority factions could be controlled, he said, by the principle that decisions would be by vote of the majority. So the real problem, according to Madison, was a majority faction. And here the solution was offered by the Constitution: to have an extensive republic, that is, a large nation ranging from 13 states. From then, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the United States. Madison, yeah, conflagration. G-R-A, shun. Yep, conflagration. Yep, it's hard to say. It's hard for me to speak. Madison's argument can be seen as a sensible argument for having a government which can maintain peace and avoid continuous disorder. But it is the aim of government simply to maintain order as a referee between two equally matched fighters? Or is it that the government has some special interest in maintaining a certain order, a certain distribution of power and wealth, a distribution in which government officials are not neutrally referees? Let's see. This interpretation makes sense when one looks at the economic interests, the social backgrounds of the makers of the Constitution. As part of his argument for a large republic to keep the peace, James Madison tells quite clearly in Federalist Number 10 whose peace he wants to keep. A rage for paper money, for the abolition of debts, for the equal division of property, and for other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. So basically, he was against the poor. Well, thanks for... It depends on which state you lived in. Certain people had more access than others. It was not, how shall I say this? Not everybody had the same access.
In the 1780s.
Yep. And also 1790s. So anybody who was against the abolition of debts, who wanted paper money, and who wanted equal division of property, they were being seen as the enemy. When the economic interest is seen behind the political clauses of the Constitution, then the document becomes simply not a work of wise men trying to establish a decent, orderly society, but the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges while giving just enough rights and liberties to enough of the people to ensure popular support. In the new government, Madison would belong to one party, the Democratic Republicans, along with Jefferson and Monroe. Hamilton would belong to a rival party, the Federalists, along with Washington and Adams. But both agreed, one a slaveholder from Virginia, the other a merchant from New York, on the aims of this new government they were establishing. They were participating in the long fundamental agreement of the two political parties in the American system. Hamilton wrote elsewhere in the Federalist Papers that the new Union would be able to suppress domestic faction and insurrection. He referred directly to Shays' Rebellion. The tempestuous situation from which Massachusetts had scarcely emerged evinces the dangers of this kind are not merely speculative. It was either Madison or Hamilton, the authorship of the individual papers is not known, who in the Federalist Paper number 63 argued the necessity of a well-constructed Senate as sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. So basically, we need a government of the people to protect them from the people. Because there are particular moments. Yeah. Isn't that ironic? Peak irony. There are particular moments in public affairs when the people stimulated by other irregular passions, yeah, or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. And in these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. In other words, until they see things from our perspective, we need to keep the people down until they see the error of their ways.
So oppression was their way of getting us to see things their way.
Exactly. If you are for equality, inclusion, and diversity, you have no place. You need to be kept down until you see things from the owner's perspective.
And that was defended by James Materson, right?
George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, yep, Hamilton, John, yep. Well, Thomas Jefferson took a different view, but he in the end accepted the Federalist position because as a slave owner, he had no choice. Yep. Well, no, he. Oh, yeah. Shea, the guy who did Shea's rebellion, he ended up dying poor. But he. Yep. But, I mean, he. Yep. Absolutely. Okay, continuing, let's see. The Constitution was a compromise between slaveholding interests of the South and money interests of the North. For the purpose of uniting the 13 states into one great market for commerce, the Northern delegates wanted laws regulating interstate commerce and urged that such laws required only a majority of Congress to pass. The South agreed to this in return for allowing the trade in slaves to continue for 20 years before being outlawed. Charles Beard warned us that governments, including the government of the United States, was not neutral, that they represented the dominant economic interests, and that their constitutions are intended to serve these purposes. One of his critics, Robert E. Brown, Charles Beard and the Constitution, raises an interesting point. Granted that the Constitution omitted the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which appeared in the Declaration of Independence, and substituted life, liberty, or property, well, why shouldn't the Constitution protect property? As Brown says, after the Revolutionary America, practically everybody was interested in the protection of property because so many Americans owned property. No, that is not true. However, this is misleading, of course. True, there were many property owners, but some people had much more than others. A few people had great amounts of property. Many people had small amounts. Others had none. Jackson, Maine found that 1/3 of the population in the Revolutionary period were small farmers, while only 3% of the population had true large holdings and would be considered wealthy. Still, 1/3 was a considerable number of people who felt that they had something at stake in the stability of the new government. This was a larger base of support for government than everywhere in the world at the end of the 18th century. In addition, the city mechanics had an important interest in a government which would protect their work from foreign competitors. As Stoughton Lynn puts it, how is it that the large city workmen all over America overwhelmingly and enthusiastically supported the United States Constitution? This was especially true in New York. When the 9th and 10th states had ratified the Constitution, 4,000 New York City mechanics marched with floats and banners to celebrate. Bakers, blacksmiths, brewers, ship joiners, shipwrights, coopers, cartmen, and tailors all marched. What Lynn found was that these mechanics, while opposing the elite rule in the colonies, were also nationalists. Mechanics comprised perhaps half of the New York population. Some were wealthy, some were poor, but all were better off than the ordinary laborer. The apprentice, the journeyman, and their prosperity required a government that would protect them against the British hats and the shoes and other goods that were pouring into the colonies after the Revolution. As a result, the mechanics often supported wealthy conservatives at the ballot box. Yikes. The Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interests of the wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics and farmers to build a broad base of support. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base of support are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, and the very poor whites. They enable the elite to control with a minimum of coercion, the maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. The Constitution became even more acceptable to the public at large after the First Congress, responding to criticism, passed a series of amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments seemed to make the new government a guardian of people's liberty, to speak, to publish, to worship, to petition, to assemble, to be tried fairly, to be secure at home against official intrusion. It was therefore perfectly designed to build popular backing for the new government. What was not made clear, it was a time when language of freedom was new and its reality untested. It was the shakiness of anyone's liberty when entrusted to a government of the rich and the powerful. Indeed, the same problem existed for the same provisions of the Constitution, like the clause forbidding states to impair the obligation of contract, or that giving Congress the power to tax the people and to approximate money. They all sound benign and neutral until one asks, taxes for who and for what? Approximate what? For whom? Appropriate for whom? To protect everyone's contracts seems like the act of fairness, of equal treatment, until one considers that contracts made between rich and poor, between employer and employee, landlord and tenant, creditor and debtor, generally favor the more powerful of the two parties. Thus, to protect these contracts is to put the great power of the government, its laws, courts, sheriffs, police, on the side of the privileged, and to do it not as a pre-modern times as an exercise of brute force against the weak, but as a matter of law. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights shows that quality of interest hiding behind the innocents. Passed in 1791 by Congress, it provided that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Yet, 7 years after the First Amendment became part of the Constitution, Congress passed a law very clearly abridging the freedom of speech. And I believe that was under John Adams. Yes, this was the Sedition Act of 1798, passed under John Adams' administration, at a time when Irishmen and Frenchmen in the United States were looked on as dangerous revolutionaries because of the recent French Revolution and Irish rebellions. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the government, Congress, or the president, with the intent to defame them, bring them into disrepute, or excite popular hatreds against them. So in other words, you can't make the government look bad. Nope. This act seemed to directly violate the First Amendment, yet it was enforced. 10 Americans were put in prison for utterances against the government, and every member of the Supreme Court in 1798 to 1800, sitting as an appellate judge, held it constitutional. So what good was the Supreme Court? There was a legal basis for this, also known as legal experts, but not to the ordinary American, who could read the First Amendment and feel confident that he or she was protected in the exercise of free speech. That basis has been explained by historian Leonard Levy. Levy points out that it was generally understood, not in the population, but in higher circles, that despite the First Amendment, the British common law of seditious libel still ruled America. Amazing. Amazing. This meant that while the government could not exercise prior restraint, that is, prevent an utterance of publication in advance. It could legally punish the speaker or writer afterwards. Thus, Congress had a convenient legal basis for the laws it has enacted since that time, making certain kinds of speech a crime. And since punishment after the fact is an excellent deterrent to the exercise of free expression, the claim of no prior restraint itself is destroyed. This leaves the First Amendment much less than the stone wall of protection it seemed at first glance. Are the economic provisions in the Constitution enforced just as weakly? We have an instructive example almost immediately in Washington's first administration, when Congress' power to tax and appropriate money was immediately put to use by the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, believing that government must ally itself with the richest elements of society to make itself strong, proposed to Congress a series of laws which it enacted expressing this philosophy. A Bank of the United States was set up as a partnership between the government and certain banking interests. A tariff was passed to help manufacturers. It was agreed to pay bondholders. Most of the war bonds were now concentrated in a small group of wealthy people. The full value of their bonds. The tax laws passed to raise money for this bond redemption. One of these tax laws was the whiskey tax, which especially hurt small farmers who raised grain that they converted into whiskey and then sold. In 1794, the farmers of western Pennsylvania took up arms and rebelled against the collection of this tax. Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton led the troops to put them down. We see then, in the first years of the Constitution, that some of its provisions, even those paraded most flamboyantly like the First Amendment, might be treated lightly. Others, like the power to tax, would be forcefully enforced. Still, the mythology around the Founding Fathers persists. To say, as one historian, Bernard Bailyn, had done recently, that the destruction of privilege and the creation of a political system that demanded of its leaders, the responsible and humane use of power were their highest aspirations, is to ignore what really happened in the America of these Founding Fathers. Bailyn writes, everyone knew the basic prescription of a wise and just government. It was so to balance the contending powers in society that no one power should overwhelm the others and unchecked destroy the liberties that belong to all. The problem was how to arrange the institutions of government so that this balance could be achieved. Were the Founding Fathers wise and just men trying to achieve a good balance? In fact, they did not want a balance, except one with which kept things as they were, a balance among the dominant forces at the time. They certainly did not want an equal balance between slaves and masters, propertyless and property holders, Indians and white. As many as half the people were not even considered by the Founding Fathers as among Bailyn's contending powers in society. They were not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. They were absent in the Constitution. They were invisible in the new political democracy. They were the women of early America. Thus ends Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is over. My goodness.
Chapter 5 wrap up Pontiac conspiracy, pioneering effort, Shays Rebellion, tell us about Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, last part, Jefferson Mains, and John Adams, Sedition Act.
Also,
I got the conflagration to go and look at.
yep, and don't forget the Whiskey Rebellion.
Whiskey Rebellion.
Whew. I am parched. Yep.
And the next thing again regarding government, there was actually a law against people talking against the government. Compare it with now.
Yep.
Compare it with now.
Yep.
Them the freedom of speech, Even now in America, say for instance, someone should say something bad about Donald Trump in a very derogatory way. Police will be pulling up at their doorstep.
Only for threats of violence. Only threats of violence. But what Trump and his minions are trying to do, they want it to make it illegal to speak against the president. They're trying to do that right now. They're not there yet, but they're slowly getting closer and closer to it. Yes.
It's not really something big, regarding the punishment part, would be very harsh, to be prisoning someone because of words that they had said up against the next person.
Yep.
Remember, they already said sticks and stones can break my bone, but words cannot. Seems as if that has no more meaning.
Yeah, well, evidently enough people are weak enough. They can't take criticism. And that's our government today in America. In the United States, we're being run by a bunch of snowflakes and weaklings and people who can't take criticism. They don't like it. They don't like to be challenged. They do not like to be told that they are wrong. They don't like to be told that they have a responsibility to protect all Americans, not just those who support you. You see?
Someone in the comment actually said the government worked for us, but they're making it look as if we work for them.
Yep. Yeah, that's the attitude that's prevalent for today. But anyway, this was good. This was fun. I'm going to have to disconnect, and I've got to.
Definitely, and hopefully I'll be having a book reading on Saturday. Can you come by?
I can try. I work third shift, so I'm usually sleeping on Saturday. But if I'm available,
Understand thoroughly, man.
you'll see me in the comments.
This is a fixed date for you though for your reading every Sunday starting at your time in what's your time in 8 o'clock?
I usually go live at 6. The problem was I was on TikTok and they gave me a ban for using a certain word. I don't know what it was. So that's when I went live on Favorited.
Yeah, I'm seeing
Yeah.
your streak is actually what? A day on air. It's actually today, so I was lucky to get to see you right here because you're normally on TikTok and I'm not a TikTok
Yeah. So
fan, you get me?
what I'm going to do from now on is I think I'm going to be live on Favorited more. I think TikTok is starting to become dead to me. I I I can't keep.
Probably you had said the word conflagration. That's why they flagged you.
Oh no, it was worse than that. If you say the word kill, death, if you say the word sexually assault, if you say the word rape or this or that, any one of those words, even if you're reading it, will get you a ban. It is so
You
ridiculous.
should come over here, man. I help me to get this reading thing a lock on this app over here,
Oh
brother.
yeah.
I really enjoyed staying with you tonight, but hopefully I can see you again, skeptically speaking.
Yes.
Remember your boy now, Rafael Viking. So see you again, man.
All right. You take care, Raphael.
Every time.
That was fun. I enjoyed myself. Yeah, so you know what? If I can't get a good hearing, if I can't do well on TikTok, I'll just come to Favorited. Fuck TikTok.